He was born a prince, crowned a child, and dethroned like a coat gone out of fashion. Richard II, King of England, was not the kind of monarch to swing his sword or charge in a battle on a mud-splattered horse. No, he preferred silks, poetry, long walks through gardens that smelled of lavender, and throne room performances that confused everyone except himself. He was the kind of king who believed that divine right meant never having to say, "I'm sorry." A ruler who thought government was a kind of performance art. And a stage? All of England. Let's begin. The boy who would be king. He was 10, barely tall enough to reach the ceremonial sword without a footstool. And yet, somehow, Richard Plantagenet became King of England in 1377. He didn't win a war. He didn't seize a crown with bloodied hands. He simply inherited it, like a bad haircut or an awkward family secret. Imagine being handed a kingdom before you're old enough to hold a wine goblet properly. While other kids were struggling with Latin verbs and wooden swords, Richard was learning how to nod gravely at council meetings and pretend to understand tax reform. He had advisors, of course, dozens of them, each one more power-hungry than the last, orbiting the child king like political vultures with law degrees. Richard's uncle, John of Gaunt, practically ruled in his name, all while cultivating the noble art of doing absolutely nothing useful. England, meanwhile, was a mess. The 100 Years' War was dragging on like a bad dinner guest. The peasants were angry about taxes, and the royal treasury was emptier than a monk's wine cellar during Lent. So Richard sat on a throne too big for his royal behind, a golden puppet among gray-haired puppeteers. And if history has taught us anything, it's that putting a child in charge of a collapsing empire is usually a recipe for drama, disaster, and the occasional execution. The Peasants' Revolt, when the kingdom nearly got canceled. It's 1381, and the English countryside is simmering like a cauldron full of rage, tax receipts, and bad hygiene. The Peasants' Revolt wasn't just about money. It was about dignity, survival, and the unshakable belief that maybe, just maybe, serfs shouldn't be taxed like royal cousins who owned 3 castles and a falcon. Enter Wat Tyler, a man with a pitchfork and a dream. He led thousands of angry, sweaty peasants straight to London, chanting slogans that were probably very rude in Middle English. They burned tax records, smashed law offices, and generally behaved like medieval Yelp reviewers with torches. And where was Richard II during this uprising of the common folk? Standing on a horse at the age of 14, facing down an army of furious villagers with a coolness that suggests he either had nerves of steel or absolutely no idea what was going on. He met the rebels, made promises, and told them he'd fix everything, which, as we know from modern politics, usually means absolutely nothing will change. Then, Wat Tyler got murdered during a meeting, sliced open in front of the king by royal officers who were clearly not briefed on conflict de-escalation. Richard, seizing the moment with theatrical flair, turned to the rebels and said something like, "I am your captain now." And just like that, the rebellion fizzled. It was dramatic, bloody, and somehow both heroic and tragic. A king barely out of puberty had stared down a revolution and survived. But history would remember that moment less as a sign of strength and more as a preview of the delusions to come. Because if you start believing you're chosen by God after surviving a peasant revolt, well, that's how you end up losing your crown in Act 5. The divine right and the Diva complex. After dodging death by peasant uprising and waving royal hands at angry mobs, Richard II began to believe he wasn't just lucky. He was special. Not special like gifted in archery or poetry, but divinely appointed by God to rule over everyone forever. Kind of special. He embraced the divine right of kings the way a child hugs a teddy bear during a thunderstorm, tight, dramatic, and with zero willingness to let go. To Richard, being king wasn't just a job. It was a cosmic calling. He wasn't just sitting on a throne. He was floating above it, glowing with the approval of heaven, and preferably bathe in candlelight while a choir hummed softly in the background. Naturally, this divine glow came with some extravagant behaviors. He started dressing like a glitter-drenched mannequin from a royal boutique, surrounding himself with flatterers, poets, and courtiers whose main skill was clapping at the right time. He passed laws that protected his personal image, banned slander, and treated criticism as a form of heresy. He even commissioned artworks of himself being handed the kingdom directly from God. Subtle. Meanwhile, the nobles, those scruffy men with swords, land, and centuries of entitlement, watched this royal theater with growing horror. To them, Richard wasn't majestic. He was becoming a full-blown diva with a crown and a god complex. And in medieval England, acting like a god was rarely a long-term career plan. Richard's vision of monarchy was absolute, theatrical, and deeply personal. He wanted loyalty, admiration, and silence from his subjects. But England was a country that preferred its kings a little more humble, a little less celestial, and a lot more politically savvy. This was not going to end with a peaceful retirement and a beach house. Enemies, exile, and a very rude cousin. If Richard II's life were a play, and spoiler alert, Shakespeare thought it was, it would now enter its tragic second act, complete with betrayal, thunderclaps, and a cousin who didn't understand the concept of waiting his turn. Enter Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, nephew to old King Edward III, and owner of the most audacious comeback tour in medieval England. At first, Henry was just another noble. He jousted, attended court, paid his taxes when someone remembered to ask, and generally stayed on the king's good side. But then, things got a little inconvenient. Richard, in a particularly theatrical fit of justice, or paranoia, banished Henry from England. 10 years in exile, just for arguing with another noble. That would have been enough to sour anyone's mood, but then Richard doubled down. When Henry's father, the mighty John of Gaunt, died, leaving behind vast lands and wealth, Richard didn't let Henry inherit. He seized everything, all the castles, titles, tapestries, and that nice set of goblets shaped like lions. "It's all mine now," said Richard, possibly while stroking a cat and laughing maniacally. This wasn't just a political move. It was a royal slap across the face, served cold, with a side of "don't come back." Unfortunately, Henry did come back, and he came back angry. Landing Yorkshire in 1399 with a few ships and an army of fed-up nobles, Henry wasn't just looking for his inheritance. He was looking for payback. His message to the realm was simple: "I'm just here for my dad's land." But his army grew and grew, and before anyone could say coup d'etat, Henry was marching towards London like it was on sale. Richard, in true tragic fashion, was out of the country at the time, off in Ireland, probably composing poetry and admiring his divine glow in a polished shield. When he returned, he found himself king of a kingdom that no longer believed in him. The nobles switched sides faster than a tavern door in a storm. Friends vanished. Supporters crumbled. Even his own inner circle started referring to Henry with a suspicious amount of enthusiasm. Cornered, abandoned, and suddenly less godlike than before, Richard surrendered, and thus began his descent, not just from throne to exile, but from myth to man, and then to prisoner. Henry was crowned Henry IV, and Richard was packed off to Pontefract Castle, a gloomy, drafty stone box perfect for reflecting on one's mistakes and perhaps writing tragic sonnets to no one in particular. There, under guard, stripped of crown, velvet, and poetic justice, Richard II faded into history. But not quite yet, because the end was still to come. The fall, a quiet death and a loud legacy. They say kings die in battle, on thrones, or in the arms of weeping courtiers. Richard II died in a castle no one wanted to be in, under circumstances no one wanted to clarify. Welcome to Pontefract Castle, northern England's least festive fortress. Cold, gray, and famously drafty, it was the kind of place that made even ghosts request relocation. After his forced abdication, Richard was imprisoned there, out of sight and definitely out of power, his days of divine right traded for a damp cell and an audience of indifferent guards. For a man who once compared himself to Christ, this was a catastrophic come-down. Gone were the flowing robes and golden scepters. In their place, silence, isolation, and quite possibly a diet of boiled cabbage. He had once demanded poetry in his court. Now he had only the echo of his own footsteps for company. And then he died. No fanfare, no final speech, no theatrical last breath whispered into loyal ears. Just death. The official story was starvation, either self-inflicted in a last act of control or imposed, depending on which chronicler had the sharper pen. Some say he refused food out of despair. Others say a knife was involved, and that someone in the new king's employ may have accidentally removed a political inconvenience. Whatever the cause, Richard's death was quiet, undignified, and very unroyal. But then something odd happened. Richard, poetic, fragile, tragic Richard, got famous. Not the kind of fame that wins parades, but the kind that births legends. Whispers spread. Was he really dead? Had he escaped? Was that man in Scotland, claiming to be Richard II years later, actually him? Some people believed it. Some still do. And even if he was gone, he wasn't forgotten. Shakespeare gave him a play. History gave him pity. And England gave him the kind of afterlife that only comes to those who fall hard and leave behind enough broken pieces to fuel 100 retellings. Henry IV might have won the crown, but Richard II, melancholic, misunderstood Richard, won immortality. Because there's something irresistible about a man who spoke in verse, believed he was ordained by heaven, and still managed to misplace an entire kingdom. He became a symbol, not of strength, but of fragility, not of power, but of the dangerous illusion of it. The king who mistook silence for loyalty, pageantry for strength, and poetry for policy. And now, as you lie in the dark, eyes fluttering shut, perhaps you feel a little closer to him, to his quiet grief, his stubborn pride, and his final, lonely days. Sleep well. You've made it through the fall of a king. He didn't, but you did. So here we are, at the end of Richard's tale. A man born to rule, taught to believe he was chosen by God himself, only to be undone by whispers, rebellions, and the very nobles who once bowed before him. He wasn't the first king to fall, and certainly not the last. But few fell quite like Richard II, with so much drama, so much poetry, and so much misunderstanding. He died believing he was right, and maybe, in some strange way, he was, just not in a way that history or England had time for. His was a story written in gold leaf and torn parchment, a glittering tragedy collapsing under the weight of its own illusions. He gave us no heirs, but he left behind verses, regrets, and the eerie memory of a monarch who wanted to be a god, but ended up a ghost. And now, hey, are you awake? Or just floating, waiting to drift off? You probably had a long day. Before you close your phone or PC, tell me, what time is it for you? Midnight? 2 a.m.? Are you listening from the US, the UK, maybe somewhere further? Wherever you are, whatever crown you wear, whether it's a hoodie pulled tight over your head or just the invisible weight of your day, know that even kings fell asleep. See you soon. Better call sleep.